Chapter 5. The Other Great Game begins. The turmoil in Korea had the unforeseen consequence of creating a resurgence of British and Russian interest in the peninsula. 3 days before the Convention of Tianjin was signed, on April 18, 1885, the British took up a temporary position at the strategically important Port Hamilton, Komundo, located off Korea's southern coast. This was due to heightened tensions between Russia and Britain over Afghanistan. The crisis between the two great powers was in many ways unexpected. Just 5 years earlier, it appeared that Russia might abandon its forward policies in Asia. This was good news for Britain, coming as it was at the end of the Second Afghan War in 1880. The British had just disentangled themselves from the Afghan quagmire by permitting Afghan tribes to maintain control of their own internal rule in exchange for British control over their foreign policy. With Russian inroads into Kabul now thwarted, it appeared that the Afghan problem, and with it the problem of protecting British India from Russian encroachment, had finally been settled. Adding to British optimism was the humiliation the Russians had suffered at the Congress of Berlin. The Russo-Turkish War, 1877 to 1878, had ended badly for Alexander II. After Turkey and Russia concluded the Treaty of San Stefano, in which the Ottomans ceded parts of Armenia and Bulgaria to the Russian Empire, Britain and Austria, fearful of Russian gains, intervened. Alexander had hoped that Otto von Bismarck, Germany's charismatic chancellor who had offered to mediate a congress in Berlin, would help him out. But the Tsar was sorely disappointed. Alexander was forced to accept a diminished Bulgaria divided between an Ottoman province in the south and an autonomous principality in the north. Serbia and Montenegro were also given full independence from Ottoman rule. As if these concessions, enforced by the Congress of Berlin in 1878, were not humiliating enough for Russia, Bismarck had seen to it that Austria would win the administration of Bosnia, while Britain ended up taking Cyprus, all won with Russian blood. The wasted victory enraged the Russian Slavophiles. But the greater damage for the Romanov dynasty was that it gave rise to a crisis for the autocracy and the beginning of revolutionary activities in Russia. Following the Emancipation Reform of 1861, which effectively abolished serfdom in the Russian Empire, Alexander II began the task of relaxing the autocratic policies of his father, Nicholas I. Partly as a response to these new liberal conditions, the nihilist movement gained momentum, challenging the old social order and demanding change, while advocating violence to achieve these goals, if necessary. The first victim was General F.F. Trepov, the governor of St. Petersburg, who was shot and wounded on January 24, 1878, by Vera Ivanova Zasulich, a 28-year-old member of the new revolutionary organization, Zemeye i Volia, Land and Liberty. Zasulich had attempted the assassination of Trepov in retaliation for the latter's brutal treatment of a fellow Zemeye i Volia member at a local prison. Although the assassination attempt failed, Zasulich's trial and acquittal were viewed sympathetically by a large segment of St. Petersburg society, signaling increasingly more negative attitudes toward the Tsarist regime. The event also signaled a change in revolutionary tactics. By the fall of 1879, the People's Will, Narodnaya Volia, a splinter group of Land and Liberty, became the first organization in history dedicated to systematic political terrorism. The organization enjoyed widespread public support, even among political moderates. Vladimir Burtsev, a historian of the Russian Revolution and a one-time member of People's Will, stated that the great majority of the Russian people actually sympathized with the terrorists. The government enjoyed no support and was estranged from the entire country. Its estrangement from society was such that even in law-abiding circles, all and each derived malicious pleasure from whatever had the smallest bearing on state authority. German Ambassador General von Schweinitz put it more bluntly, "As the state decays more and more, nihilist sects grow bolder, and discontent among all the educated classes becomes more pronounced. The disappointing outcome of the war had allowed the mask of Russia's imperial authority to slip, allowing a handful of determined terrorists to threaten the regime. By the end of his reign, Alexander noted in his diary, "I find myself like a wolf tracked by hunters." But the humiliations of the Congress of Berlin and the increasingly volatile domestic situation did not completely curb Russian adventurism as the British had hoped it would. During the fall of 1880, the British government received reports of a major military campaign undertaken by the Russians in the region to the east of the Caspian, the Transcaspia as it was known. The commander-in-charge, General Mikhail Skobelev, the hero of the Russo-Turkish War, had returned to Turkestan after the war to lead a bloody siege against the city of Geotip, the decisive action in the Russian campaign to conquer the Teke Turkomans, present-day Turkmenistan. It fell on January 24, 1881, resulting in a massacre of 8,000 Turkomans. Following an outcry from Europe for the bloodbath and worried about Slobelev's own aspirations for political power, Alexander relieved the general of his command. But the question on everyone's mind was whether Russia's eastward advance would stop. British Prime Minister William Ewart Gladstone and his Liberal supporters were convinced that it would. "The most satisfactory feature of General Slobelev's victory is that it affords the Russian government to abandon the Turkoman country," wrote the Pall Mall Gazette. "They have vindicated their prestige, captured the stronghold of their enemies, and they can now follow our example in Afghanistan by abandoning a territory which would be even more costly to hold than to conquer." Since Geotip was of little strategic significance, the British government took General Skobelev's declaration at face value when he announced, "The whole of Turkoman territory was not worth buying at the cost of a single ruble." Britain's Russophobes were not so certain. Following the siege of Geotip, and especially after the news that General Chinese Gordon had been cut down by a fanatical mob in Khartoum in January 1885, a new breed of forward-thinking commentators began to make their voices heard. Among them, Charles Marvin, whose books and pamphlets enjoyed a large popular following, was particularly influential. Fluent in Russian, Marvin was also a vivid and persuasive writer. His Russian Advance Towards India, published in 1882, put him on the proverbial Russophobe map. Marvin argued that successive British governments, especially liberal ones, had been vacillating and spineless in their relations with Russia. What concerned Marvin after the siege of Geotip was whether the Russians might now press eastward to the city of Merv, located in southeastern Turkmenistan, from where they could easily be able to march into Afghanistan and take Herat. From there, the route to British India lay wide open. Russian Foreign Minister Gears, however, was quick to reassure the British ambassador, Lord Dufferin, that his country had no further ambitions in Transcapia. "We do not intend to go to Merv, nor do anything which may be interpreted as a menace to England," he stated emphatically. Emperor Alexander reiterated his solemn assurances that Russia would never occupy Merv. "Not only do we not want to go there, but happily there is nothing which can require us to go there." This conciliatory stance seemed to be reconfirmed by Russia's attitude in other parts of the world. News that the Russians had finally withdrawn from Kulja, or Ili, as the Chinese called it, located to the northeast of Kashgar, and returned it to Chinese control, was encouraging. The Treaty of St. Petersburg, 1881, which had finally settled the Ili crisis, was a triumph for China, for as the British ambassador to Russia, Lord Dufferin, put it, the Chinese had compelled Russia to do what she has never done before, disgorge territory that she once absorbed. Apart from their sale of Alaska to the United States in 1867 for $7 million, the Russians had not been known to haul down their flag anywhere. Russian crisis. To Prime Minister Gladstone and his new Liberal government, which was swept into power in 1880 on the strength of a strongly anti-imperial electoral campaign, this was all very encouraging news. The foreign press shared a collective sigh of relief. Everything is full of hope for the new government, opined the New York Times. Russia is to be conquered by friendship. The Tsar is very poorly, but his ministers are ready to make any kind of treaty with Gladstone. What Gladstone and the British public could not have known was that Alexander II would soon be dead. His legs were blown off by a terrorist's bomb on March 13, Old Style March 1, 1881, while on his way back to the Winter Palace after reviewing his troops. Alexander III, the successor and son of the great emancipator, thus began his reign in the midst of one of the gravest crises ever to face the Romanov dynasty. The assassination had been planned not as part of a palace coup d'etat to place another member of the family on the throne, but as part of a revolutionary plot to abolish autocracy in Russia altogether. Naturally, the new Tsar had a grim view of his father's martyred death. We knew that something immeasurably greater than a loving uncle and a courageous emperor had receded with him into the past, observed Alexander Mikhailovich, Alexander II's nephew. Idyllic Russia, the country of the ruling father and obedient sons, ceased to exist on March 1, 1881. Assuming the throne stained by his father's blood, Alexander III, nicknamed the Colossus after his towering frame, he was 6 feet 3 inches tall, blamed most of Russia's ills on the irresponsible liberalism governing the nation's domestic affairs. As the autocrat who had launched the great emancipation reform, Alexander II had been reluctant to ruthlessly suppress the political revolutionaries who had emerged in the new social and political climate that he had helped to create. His son harbored no such hesitation. The press was harshly restricted. It is impossible to make a good beginning at anything until the newspapers are restrained. Konstantin Pobedonostsev, Alexander's closest advisor, wrote less than 2 months after the Tsar's accession. A fanatical belief in the autocracy and Russia's Slavophile mission, Pobedonostsev urged the new Tsar to institute a series of provisional censorship regulations in August 1882 that would make the reign of Alexander III the most reactionary regime since the final years of Nicholas I's rule. To meet the regime's new security demands, the Tsar's government established the Okhrana Oddelenia, Okhrana, a secret service to infiltrate and destroy terrorist movements. The repressive measures paid off. With the help of Grigory Sudeikin, chief of the St. Petersburg Okhrana, who enlisted highly placed informants within the people's will, Pobedonostsev was able to wipe out the entire revolutionary organization. 2 years after his ascension to the throne, Alexander III finally felt safe enough to announce his coronation ceremony on January 25, 1883. The emperor also laid out a new direction in Russia's foreign policy. Although a staunch believer in Russia's Slavophile mission and proud imperialist spirit, he was determined to avoid war. Emperor Alexander III's greatest achievement, wrote his finance minister, Sergei Witta, was that he gave Russia 13 years of peace, not by being weak, but by being fair and unswervingly firm. He had no dreams of conquest or military laurels. Other nations knew this, but they knew too that under no circumstances would he besmirch the honor and dignity of Russia entrusted to him by God. Alexander III saw his role slightly differently. "We have just 2 allies in the world," he used to repeat to his ministers, "our army and our navy. Everybody else will turn on us at a second's notice." The Tsar sought to undo the humiliations suffered by Russia's war with Turkey by restoring the army after its disorganization and shoring up the country's finances. An adroit and efficient administrator, Alexander III said little, but what he said he meant, and he never retreated from his word. Alexander III's first real foreign policy challenge occurred in March 1885, despite his father's solemn pledge regarding the Russian annexation of Merv. He allowed an enterprising young officer, Lieutenant Alikhanov, to take the city on March 16, 1884. This action received howls of protests from Britain's Russophobes, but had surprisingly little effect on the Gladstone government, which was not inclined to be pushed into precipitate action by an alarmist press. Marvin's pamphlet with the headline in all capital letters, "The annexation of Merv being inevitably attended with the incorporation of the Sarikh Turkomans, will extend Russia rule to Panjshir, or within 140 miles of the Key of India," was ignored. Lord Granville, the British Foreign Secretary, simply informed the Russian ambassador, Baron Arthur von Morenheim, that the news concerning Merv had not been received with indifference. 12 months later, Marvin's warning came true. The standoff between the two great powers took place at the remote oasis of Panjshir on the Murghab River, located halfway between Merv and Herat near the Afghan border. On March 30, 1885, an Afghan force, goaded by the calculating Alikhanov, attacked a Russian unit. Using this as a pretext, General Komarov, the Russian commander, ordered a counterattack, taking Panjshir. The arrival of the news of Russia's seizure of Panjshir in London a week later led most people to assume that war between Russia and Britain was now inevitable. In America, the normally sober New York Times blared, "England and Russia almost sure to fight." Gladstone, who had been made a fool of by Gears, denounced the Russian slaughter of Afghans and the Russian occupation of Panjshir, and announced that he was putting Britain on a war footing. Alexander III seemed to believe that his bold foreign policy was worth the risk. If he had hoped to wrest his country from the humiliations suffered at the Congress of Berlin and restore the Romanov autocracy to the power and glory it had known in the early 19th century, he was mostly successful. The magnificent autocrat of Gachina had dealt the revolutionaries a severe blow, Alexander Mikhailovich observed. The Journal de St. Petersburg reported, "The Tsar appeared at the theater last evening, April 10. The audience, still enthusiastic over the news of Panjshir on the general assumption that Komarov's conduct had the imperial approval, arose when they saw the Tsar and shook the building with an ovation of applause." The contrast between the gloomy last days of Alexander II and the promise of a bolder and stronger Russia presaged by Alexander III was striking. What neither the Russians nor the British could foresee, however, was how the renewed conflict in Central Asia would affect their Far Eastern policies. In 1885, the Great Game made its way to East Asia. Port Hamilton.